Good evening, this is Mr. Carranza. Let's take a look at two problems that involve crossing. Now, when we say crossing, or whenever we see this symbol, which is an X, we know that we have two different organisms which are reproducing with each other. Now, first thing, since we have two different organisms, we know right away that we are talking about sexual reproduction. And what that means is that each of these parents are going to give us half of their genes, half of the genetic material that we need to make a new organism. So 50% from this parent and 50% from this parent. It doesn't matter that we're talking about a father or a mother, one plant or another. It's always going to be 50% from each. Now, second thing, since we're still talking about sexually reproducing organisms, we know each of the parents is going to have two alleles. An allele basically means that we have one trait that we're looking at. In this case, we're looking at the color of the flower, and we have two different variations. We have purple and non-purple. And notice that I'm looking at the same plant. This plant right here has one purple allele and one non-purple allele. The reason we have the purple color in the flower is because purple is our dominant allele. That means that it doesn't matter what we have. If we are in the presence or if we have a dominant allele, we are going to end up with the dominant trait. Now, this is the opposite example. This is a plant that only has recessive alleles. The only way we could have that recessive trait, that white flower, is because we have two recessive alleles at the same time. Now, let's go to the problem, but before we solve it, let's take a look at these two definitions, homozygous and heterozygous. We're going to encounter these two words a lot when talking about genetics and heredity, especially if we do research online. And if we want to define homozygous, we have to go to the root of the word. Homozygous means the same. And because they are the same, we know that we are talking about two alleles which are the same. In this case, we could have either two dominant alleles, which we're going to call homozygous dominant, or we can have two recessive alleles, which we're going to call homozygous recessive. Now, we look at this plant in the beginning. This is a homozygous recessive because both of the alleles that this plant has are recessive. Now let's look at this one, heterozygous. Hetero means different, so we know that we could only have one possibility. One dominant, one recessive. And remember, guys, this is the same as if we were talking about plants, humans, animals. We're always going to have these two types of combinations. Doesn't matter what type of organisms we have, as long as they reproduce sexually, we're going to have two different alleles for every gene. Now let's do the problem right away. So we have two plants right here. This plant is going to give us purple flowers, and we are going to determine right now that purple is the dominant color. So we're going to give it a purple allele, but we're also going to give it a non-purple allele, which means this plant is heterozygous. Now for this one, let's give it two recessive alleles. So we have a homozygous recessive right here, and right away let's cross them. So they're going to reproduce with each other, and we're going to see what kind of combinations can we get. To do this, to approach this sort of problem, we have to first divide the alleles. So remember, in the lesson you read about meiosis. Meiosis is the process in which we separate alleles in order to form gametes or sex cells. So we're gonna just emulate the same process, and we're gonna separate those alleles into two. And this is just gonna facilitate, it's gonna make it easier to actually know what combinations can we get. So the first allele that we're gonna put in here is our purple allele, our dominant allele, and the second one is going to be our recessive allele. And for the second plant, we have two recessive alleles. Very simple. Now, how do we actually cross them? How do we know what kind of kids, what kind of offsprings can we get from this crossing? We're going to actually use math. So if you remember from math, we can have something that is called the distribution property, or else some people call it FOIL. And FOIL means that every single one of these terms, every single one of these variables are going to multiply with each other. So let's do that right away. So the first one is going to multiply with this. That's our dominant, going to multiply with one of the recessives. And then it's going to go for the other recessives. We're going to multiply that as well. Now we're going to multiply the recessive with the recessive and the recessive with the other recessive. So if you kept track, we have 4 combinations that we can have, 4 different operations that we just made, and let's see what the result was. Now let's see, the first one is the dominant multiplying with this one, so we're gonna have a purple allele combined with our non-purple allele. That's our first combination. That's gonna be the first offspring, the first seed, or the first plant that we get. The second one is gonna be very similar, if not the same. It's gonna be a dominant with a recessive allele. Now, something I want to make sure is that you are not making the same operation twice. Remember, even though they look identical, this P right here is different from this P right here. This P came from one allele, and this P came from the other allele. They happen to be the same allele, but remember, if we're looking at a microscope and we're looking at the DNA of this plant, we're going to have 2 identical alleles for each chromosome. So let's keep that in mind. Now, the third one, the third combination that we're going to have is a recessive with a recessive. And lastly, we're going to have a recessive with another recessive. So we ended up having 4 different combinations, just like we predicted. And now let's decide what type of plants we get. So the first one, right away, we don't need to know anything else. We know that there is a dominant allele, so right away we know we got a purple flower. So let's just put this flower right here. So we know we got a purple flower. The second one, we also have a dominant one, so we also have a purple flower as well. The third one, we have a recessive combination, a recessive homozygous. So we know we're gonna have the color of the homozygous, because this plant has no option but to be white, to be non-color. And the fourth one is gonna be also a homozygous recessive, which is gonna give us this. Now, every time we do these kind of problems, it's gonna ask us what kind of ratios did we get. But before we do the ratios, let's do the percentages, because percentages sometimes are a little more common sense. So we're gonna look in here, and we're gonna look in here. We got 50% or half for purple plants, and we got 50% or half for non-purple plants. And if you remember from ratios, that means that we got a 1-to-1 ratio. So in this case it's 2-to-2, but if we simplify it, we're gonna have a 1-to-1 ratio. And the good thing about this is that every time we do this operation, we cross a heterozygous with a homozygous recessive, we're gonna end up with the same distribution, with the same ratio. So we're gonna do this for a week and a half. You did this right now. Every time we do this type of crossing, doesn't matter that we're talking about plants, we're talking about humans, we're talking about the color of the eyes, the color of the hair. If we're looking at 2 organisms that have 2 alleles, we're gonna end up with the same ratio. Let's do one more just for good measure. So if you keep going down the lesson, you're gonna find the second crossing, which is heterozygous with heterozygous. So notice both plants are purple, and they are heterozygous, which means they have 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele, which doesn't show in the plant because the dominant is taking over, is masking or hiding the recessive allele. So let's go right ahead and do that problem. Now we're gonna use our brushing here, a little smaller. And first we're gonna just label the alleles. So we know we have purple allele with a non-purple allele, and we have another purple allele, dominant purple, with a non-purple allele. Now let's do the same kind of thing. We're gonna cross them. We're gonna cross them again, and we're gonna see what type of combinations we can get. Now let's do the first one, okay? Let's do it a little smaller. First one, we're gonna have a dominant allele with a non-dominant allele, with a recessive allele, and the second one we're gonna have another as well, a dominant allele with a recessive allele. If we want to multiply, which we want to do because we want to see what kind of combinations we can get, or what new exciting combinations we can get from this crossing, we need to use the same FOIL or distribution property. So we're gonna have this one multiplying this one multiplying this allele combining with this, and this allele combining with this. Remember, if we are looking at real life, we will be looking at gametes that are combining between the two plants. So remember, plants reproduce with pollen and eggs. Each one of these is gonna be one cell, one pollen cell, and each one of these is gonna be one ovule cell, one egg cell. And it could be vice versa too. It could be this one could be the pollen, this could be the eggs. So remember, plants could be both. So that's what we know right now. Now let's look at the combinations that we can get. We have a P with a P. First interesting new combination. We have a dominant with a dominant. That's our first one. We have a dominant with a recessive. That's our second combination. And we have a recessive with a recessive. Let's look at it right now. And let me draw it right here just from convenience. You're going to see why I draw here. And we also have, lastly, one recessive with a dominant. So again, 4 combinations. 4 combinations, and let's see what kind of traits do we get. So the first one, really intuitive, really easy to tell. This one is going to give us a purple plant. No question about it. Second one could be confusing because we see the recessive allele, but because we have a dominant allele, we know every single time we're going to have a purple plant. Third one is the same. And the last one, surprisingly, it's a non-purple plant. It's a white plant. Okay, so let's give it that color. All right, it's not letting us. Let's just do it like this. Let's just draw it, okay? All right, so that's our purple plant. Let's hide this one right here. So if you're looking here, surprisingly, we got a non-purple plant. And remember, the two parents, they show the purple trait, but because we have one recessive allele in each plant hiding, we very well end up with a plant that doesn't look like the parents. And if we were looking at humans, we could say that this plant is just like that trait that you have that you don't really share with your parents, but you might share with one or more than one of your grandparents. So this is what we call a recessive trait that was hidden, was carried by your parents, and you ended up getting that recessive trait without them really having it in their, expressing it in their bodies, expressing it in the way they look. But you obviously had it, and this plant definitely had it. And now let's look at what ratios did we get. But before we do the ratios, let's do the percentages again. So if we look at this one, the purple plants overwhelmingly got a 75% of the distribution, and the non-purple plant got a 25%. That means that for every 3 plants that we get, for every 4 plants that we get, 3 of them are going to be purple. 1 of them is going to be non-purple. So if we were planting the seeds in a garden, so if we cross this one and we got maybe 100 seeds, and we were planting those seeds in a garden, in that garden, every 3 out of 4 plants are gonna be purple. So if you were to look at that garden, it would be a really pretty garden. Most of the plants would be purple. 75% of the plants would be purple. 25% of the plants would be non-purple. And remember, we could be talking about human traits as well. We could be talking about the color of your eyes, the color of your hair, different measures like the length of your nose. So different traits that have a dominant and recessive allele. Now let's look at the ratios. Lastly, this is the last part. We are gonna look at the ratios. And the ratio, very simply, we're gonna say is a 3-to-1 ratio. That means that 1, 2, 3 to 1 ratio. Now the good thing, and I'm gonna finish with this, the nice thing to know is that every time we have this heterozygous crossing, every time we cross 2 heterozygous organisms, we're always gonna end up with the same ratio. So for the next week and a half, if you have two heterozygous crossings, even if you don't do this, even if you are not solving it, you already know in the back of your head that you have a 3-to-1 ratio. And the 3-to-1 ratio is dominant to recessive. All right, so 3 dominants per every 4. 3 dominants and 1 recessive. That's all for today. If you have any questions, please contact me. I'm happy to answer any questions, and you have a good night. Bye.